الرحمن علم القرآن خلق الإنسان علمه البيان الشمس والقمر بحسبان والنجم والشجر يسجدان.
Assalamu alaikum, my friends. Welcome back to Revelation Kids Qur'an Year 13. This is the Hijrah, and today's line is building something extraordinary. Here's what no one tells you about building something extraordinary. It almost never begins the way you imagine. It doesn't begin with a crowd cheering or a clear path stretching out in front of you. It often begins with a door closing. It begins with a walk through the dark, with nothing but trust in the one who called you to move forward. Tonight, in Qur'an Year 13, the Prophet, peace upon him, will leave Mecca. He'll leave the city of his birth, the city where he grew up and where he married Khadija and raised his children. He'll actually leave the city where he buried one of his sons. Every street, every alley was familiar to the Prophet, peace upon him, and now he would leave it all. But what he will build on the other side is something that no one could ever have imagined. In the last episode, we reviewed the Meccan period. If you remember, 1, 2, 3 were the private years, and year 4 was the first public year. Year 5 was 5 Fingers, the Mnemonic, and Abyssinia. So that's when Ja'far went to Abyssinia to talk to the Najashi. Year 6 was a year of Hamza and Umar's conversion. 7, 8, 9 were the ban years when the Prophet, peace upon him, and his family was kicked out of Mecca. And year 10 was a long year of sadness. That was when he has lost his wife Khadija and his uncle Abu Talib and was kicked out of the city of Taif. Year 11, remember it rhymes with heaven, that's the Isra and the Mi'raj, the amazing miraculous journey at night where he went from Mecca to Jerusalem and up to the heavens and then back to Jerusalem and then back to Mecca. And then year 12 was the year that 12 pilgrims pledged to take care of the Prophet, peace upon him, in this new city called Yathrib, later to be called Medina. That was in Qur'an Year 12. Today we're in Qur'an Year 13. And in Qur'an Year 13, what you have to realize is that the Prophet begins the year in Mecca. And at this point, the Quraysh are really upset because the Prophet Muhammad, peace upon him, is still alive and has gotten away and survived everything that they've thrown at him. The believers are still believing in him. And so they decide to do something really terrible. The leaders of the Quraysh gathered in secret to make a decision that they had been putting off for years. They had tried mocking the Prophet. They had tried starvation. They had tried exile and isolation, and nothing had worked. And now the Muslims were growing stronger, with men like Hamza and Umar standing beside the Prophet, with the city in the north ready to welcome him. The Quraysh felt like a window was closing. They had very limited time to finally attack Muhammad, peace be upon him. So they all met in private, and they debated their options. Should they imprison him? Exile him? Maybe kill him? How could they do such a thing? But after much discussion, they decided that the only way to end his mission was to kill him. And to make sure that no single clan would be blamed and forced to pay the price of killing the Prophet, they agreed that one young man from every clan should strike the Prophet at once. That way, if all the clans were guilty of killing the Prophet, no one family could be held accountable for what all of them had done together. That night, armed men took their positions around the Prophet's house and waited for dawn. But Allah had already told His Prophet what they were planning, because Allah was always watching over the Prophet, peace upon him, just like Allah is always watching over you. And so, quietly, with complete calm, the Prophet, peace upon him, did 2 things. He went to his young cousin Ali. He wrapped him in his own green cloak around him, and he asked him to sleep in the Prophet's bed. This is called a decoy, because the Quraysh would think that the Prophet was sleeping in the bed, but it was really his brave, courageous nephew Ali. The Prophet, peace upon him, also told Ali to stay behind after the Prophet left Mecca, to return all of the Prophet's valuables that people had entrusted to him. Ali, of course, was courageous, and he agreed without hesitation. He was still just a young man, a teenager at this point, but he was the reason the Prophet, peace upon him, could escape successfully. He lay down in the Prophet's place, ready for whatever the morning could bring. That fateful night, the Prophet, peace upon him, stepped to his doorway. Outside in the shadows, the armed men were waiting, the killers. And the Prophet walked right past them. He was reciting verses from one of the most beautiful surahs in the Qur'an, Surah Yasin.
وجعلنا من بين أيديهم سدا ومن خلفهم سدا فأغشيناهم فهم لا يبصرون وسواء عليهم أأنذرتهم أم لم تنذرهم لا يؤمنون.
He recited words that Allah had revealed years before, speaking of people who had been covered in the darkness so much so that they could not see. And this is exactly what happened. The men were standing right there, and they could not see the Prophet. He walked right past the men and disappeared into the black night. When the men burst through the door at dawn, ready to strike, they found Ali. At first they may have thought it was the Prophet, peace upon him, but when they pulled the sheets and they saw it was his nephew, calm, unafraid, courageous, lying in the bed, the men realized the Prophet had escaped. Now here's what's amazing about the Prophet Muhammad, peace upon him. He didn't just leave without making a plan. He planned the hijrah, which means the migration from Mecca to Medina. He planned the hijrah really carefully, really strategically. That means he made a plan and he followed through. See, what normally would have happened when you go from Mecca to Medina is you travel straight north, up from Mecca, which is in the south, to Medina, which is in the north. And everyone would have expected him to go north to Yathrib, which will later be called Medina. But instead, the Prophet went south. He went 5 miles in the opposite direction, into the rocky hills outside of Mecca, to a cave, a mountain called Thawr. He and his closest companion, Abu Bakr, climbed through the darkness together, and behind them a shepherd was arranged to quietly walk his flock back across their footprints, so that none of the Prophet and Abu Bakr's footprints could be seen. This was strategy. First, the Prophet went in a different, unexpected direction, in fact, the opposite direction. And secondly, he arranged for a shepherd to cover up his and Abu Bakr's tracks. Back in Mecca, the Quraysh woke up to the news that the Prophet had escaped. They were furious. A bounty of 100 camels was announced for each of the 2 men, and the search parties fanned out across every road leaving from the city. Most of them went north, but 1 or 2 groups went south, and they even climbed Mount Thawr, the very mountain which the Prophet and Abu Bakr were hiding in. As they approached, Abu Bakr, sitting in the cave, could hear them getting closer. Perhaps he could see the shadows moving across the entrance. He leaned close to the Prophet, and he whispered that if any one of the men looked down at their feet, they would see both the Prophet and Abu Bakr hiding in this shallow cave. But the Prophet, peace upon him, was fearless. He looked at Abu Bakr with complete calm and said, "Abu Bakr, what do you think about 2 people when Allah is the third?" Did you hear that? The Prophet was basically telling Abu Bakr that it wasn't just the 2 of them there waiting. Allah was always with them, because the Prophet always knew that Allah was always by his side, always there with him, closer to him than even Abu Bakr was. And so the Prophet was reminding Abu Bakr that Allah was watching, Allah was planning, and Allah would protect them. In other words, he's saying, Abu Bakr, don't be afraid. You're not alone. This is a really powerful thing I want you guys to think about. For the rest of your lives, remember, as long as you are close to Allah, Allah will be even closer to you. You should never be afraid, because you are never, ever alone. The Qur'an, in fact, would later preserve that moment, these two men in the dark, everything pressing around them, with 4 words that have steadied the hearts of so many Muslims throughout the hundreds of years, the thousands of years since the Qur'an was first revealed. Allah said in one surah, the Prophet said to Abu Bakr, "Don't be afraid, for God is with us." Then something happened that no search party could explain. When the men reached the mouth of the cave, they stopped. Stretched across the entrance was a freshly spun spider web, unbroken, undisturbed. And just above it, a dove sat quietly on her nest, as if no one had passed that way in days. The men looked around. They looked at it. They realized no one could have gone to this cave, because had they gone in, they would have disrupted the spider's web, and the bird would have flown away. So they decided to move on from the cave and look elsewhere. They walked down the mountain and back to Mecca. A spider's nest, a spider's web, a dove's nest, the smallest, most overlooked creatures in the world, and Allah had used them to protect His Prophet. See, Allah's signs don't always arrive in thunder and lightning. Sometimes they arrive on 8 tiny legs, a little spider. And they arrive at exactly the moment they are needed the most. The 2 men stayed in the cave for 3 days. Abu Bakr's son and daughter crept up the mountain each night with food and news from the city, and when the time came to move, Abu Bakr had already arranged for a trusted guide, a man who knew the desert roads, to lead them south across the coast before turning north towards Yathrib. It was not a direct route. In fact, it was a very indirect route. It was an unexpected route, and they had planned that so that the Quraysh could never find them. As Mecca faded behind them, the Qur'an understood what the Prophet was feeling. He was sad to leave. This was the birthplace of not just him, but his father, his father's father, going all the way back to Ismail as-salam, who, with his father, had built the Kaaba and established Mecca as a city it has now become. Allah was with the Prophet. He knew what he was feeling in his heart. He knew he didn't want to leave, but he had to. And so Allah told him in one very powerful verse that the one who bestowed the Qur'an upon you will surely bring you back to your destination. Allah was basically telling the Prophet, don't worry, I know you're leaving, and I know your heart aches to leave your hometown, but one day I'll bring you back to this place that you long for. For now, you have to go somewhere else and build something extraordinary. 12 days after leaving Mecca, the Prophet and Abu Bakr reached a village called Quba. It's on the outskirts of Yathrib, on the south side of the city. The people there had been waiting for days. Every morning, some of them had climbed to the edge of the village and scanned the horizon, hoping to see the Prophet coming. Every morning, nothing happened. Until the day, a man spotted 2 figures moving closer and called out so the whole village could hear. The Prophet and Abu Bakr got closer and closer. And by the time he made it to Quba, he was surrounded by throngs of people. Dusty from the road, he finally arrived, and he spoke to all of them. And the first words in his new home were not words about battles or enemies, or the long road behind him, or the long road ahead. He said something so powerful, it's one of the most important sayings of the Prophet in all of his sayings. It's called the Hadith as-Salam, or the saying of peace. The Prophet instructed the people to do 4 things. He said, O people, give greetings of peace to each other. Feed the hungry, honor your family ties, and pray in the hours of night when other people are sleeping. If you do these 4 things, you will enter paradise in peace. This is called the saying of peace. The Prophet is basically saying that there are 4 things for a believer to do. 3 of them are helping others, and 1 is for yourself. The Prophet was establishing a tradition of Islam, and that tradition is that a true believer is constantly going out of his way to think about other people and make sure that he's helping others who don't have as much as he has. Of course, a Muslim should be praying and fasting and paying zakat and doing all the things that Allah asks of a Muslim. But at the end of the day, if he's not helping others, he's really not getting the message. the Prophet was describing what an ideal community looks like, and this was the very first instructions he gave them. He rested in Quba for a few days, but before moving on, he laid the foundations for a mosque, the very first mosque built in Islam. It was not a house for himself, it was a house dedicated to the worship of Allah. Then, escorted through the streets lined with people, the Prophet, peace upon him, finally entered Yathrib. Children climbed on rooftops to see him. The sound of celebration filled the city. He rode his camel Qaswa through it all, and people pressed forward from every direction, calling out for the honor of hosting him in their home. And then Qaswa slowed. She stopped. She rose, walked a few steps, and knelt. She would not move again. Where was Qaswa stopping? Right there in a quiet open courtyard belonging to two orphans, two boys named Sahal and Suhail. The Prophet looked at the courtyard and said, "That is where he will stay." When the boys offered their land as a gift to the Prophet so that he could build his house there, the Prophet, peace upon him, insisted on paying for it. This was the Prophet's hijrah also, and he insisted on paying for everything himself. On that purchased ground, that ordinary ground, the Prophet began to build something extraordinary. The masjid that rose from that courtyard was simple: stone and adobe walls, a roof, a partial roof of palm leaves, and by any measure it was very modest. They didn't have a lot when they arrived to Medina. But what was built around it was something the world had not seen before. The Prophet established a bond of brotherhood between the immigrants, or muhajirin. These are the people from Mecca who escaped and went to Medina. He made a bond of brotherhood between those people and the helpers, the people who lived in Yathrib and were welcoming the Muslims into the city. Those people are called the Ansar. So you have the Muhajirin, the people from Mecca, and the Ansar, the people who were receiving them in Yathrib, which will now be called Medina. He paired these two brothers, an emigrant and a helper, a Muhajirin and an Ansar. He paired them together one by one. And the helpers did not simply offer charity, they opened their homes, divided their orchards, shared their livelihoods. Because the Muhajirin arrived with nothing, and the Ansar gave them half of everything they had. That kind of generosity has to be built on something deeper than kindness. It has to be built on purpose, on the belief that this community matters, and that what you are building together is worth the cost, no matter what you have to give up. And then the Prophet did something that showed the full scale of what he was trying to build. He drafted something called a constitution. A constitution, maybe some of you have studied this before, is a document, a written letter that explains all the rules of the new society. It was a written agreement between all the tribes of the city, Muslim and Jewish alike. Because not all of Medina was Muslim. There were Jews who lived in the city also. And the Prophet recognized that every group had its rights. Every group had its responsibilities. The city that had been tearing itself apart for years, divided by old grudges, remember, between the tribes of Aus and Khazraj? The Prophet wanted to unite this city. And so what he did is he drafted this constitution that showed how they could each cooperate with each other and get along. With the constitution now written, Yathrib disappeared, because in its place stood a new city with a new name. The name was Medina al-Munawwara, the city of light. But the companions started calling it Medina, the city for short. And at the heart of it, in a courtyard that once belonged to two orphan boys, a community gathered 5 times a day and bowed before their same God, their creator. They all bowed together, Ansar side by side with Muhajirin. They were one united community. And that is the legacy of the Hijrah. It's not just a journey from one city to another. It's about a new beginning, built from the ground up by people who had lost everything and chose to give up everything. The reason they did that is because Al-Khaliq, another name for Allah, the Creator, He was building something through their efforts. This is Qur'an year 13, the year the Prophet walked past armed men who could not see him, the year a spider web and a nesting dove protected two men in a cave. This is the year Abu Bakr trembled with fear and the Prophet told him, "Don't be afraid, for God is with us." This is a year a camel knelt in an orphan's courtyard and a city was born, and a year the community of people who had lost everything built something the world had never ever seen before. Not because they had the most resources, not because they were rich, but because they had the most purpose and they believed. Mecca was ordinary. Medina was becoming extraordinary. And sometimes you have to leave the ordinary to build something extraordinary. But building something new doesn't mean that old enemies disappear. The Quraysh are still out there. They're still angry and they're still planning. They're fuming that the Prophet escaped. And soon the Prophet, peace upon him, will face a question every leader dreads. How do you protect what you've built without losing what you stand for? Qur'an year 14 will be coming up in the next episode, and its title is Only by Getting Out of Your Own Way. I'll see you tomorrow night in Qur'an year 14. Assalamu alaikum.
إن الذين قالوا ربنا الله ثم استقاموا فلا خوف عليهم ولا هم يحزنون أولئك أصحاب الجنة خالدين فيها جزاء بما كانوا يعملون